afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted to be here with this man I've been reading and watching as long as I've been in Washington, which is just a couple of years, actually 40. But this is George Will's, the book that is sitting on the table in front of us, and I hope you all will get a chance to look at it, to get a copy and get George to sign it. It is George's 16th book, is that right?
15th.
15th book. George Will, arguably the most prolific public intellectual of our time, since Daniel Patrick Moynihan, William F. Buckley, somebody who has looked at, thought about conservatism, public policy, how Americans think, how we approach public life for his entire adult life. So we're here to talk about Conservatism Under Threat. George, that was the title they gave this session. And as Kitty just said, I think Kitty just said, you know, what's going to happen to conservatism? And you said in a low voice, will there even be a conservatism in the future? Are you that worried about it?
No, I'm not. This book, which is the most important publishing event since Gutenberg invented movable type, is going to guarantee its future.
Why at this moment are you writing a book called The Conservative Sensibility?
Well, I would have written the book even if the 2016 election had turned out differently. I was on Bill Maher's show, and Maher said, George, the name Donald Trump doesn't appear in there. And I said, also the name of Doris Day doesn't appear in there, because it's a book about ideas. I wanted to establish that the intellectual pedigree of conservatism, and to refute the most common misperception about conservatism, which is, and it's understandable given the word conservatism, people think conservatives only want to conserve, and they want to conserve the past, sort of freeze society like a fly in amber. In fact, American conservatism, and in that phrase, the adjective American does a lot of work, is distinguished from European conservatism, which was evolved largely in the defense of established orders and hierarchies. American conservatism is precisely the reverse. It is to preserve a society open to perpetual dynamic change. To do that, you have to go back to the past. You have to conserve the founders' vision, which was natural rights, limited government, and separation of powers, to give society an enormous social space in which the forces, the creative forces of the spontaneous order of society can flourish. Virginia Postrel, who you may know, a Washington writer, very prolific, said the story of the Bible in one sentence is God created man and woman and lost control of events. The conservative sensibility relishes the absence of control. It's the openness of the future. It's Hayek's spontaneous order of society that conservatism exists to conserve. It's a paradox. We're trying to conserve perpetual change.
And I want to ask you about that, because a lot of people think, okay, you want to take us back to a time, you know, we have some idea from reading of what this country was like in the 16 and 17, at the end of the 1700s. But people have a sense that it was, you know, we know who the founding fathers were, and they were all fathers. What was it about them that has that enduring quality? Because so many people say, why do you want to take us back to the original idea of America? I think many, if not most Americans don't understand this being open to perpetual change piece of it that you're talking about.
I don't want to take the country back to a time before. I want to take us back to premises before. Woodrow Wilson, who really created the vocabulary of dissatisfaction with the founders, was the first founder to criticize the American founding. It was the first president to criticize the American founding, which is, all of our political argument today, I think, can be understood as an argument between two Princetonians. James Madison of the class of 1771 and Woodrow Wilson of the class of 1879. Wilson did not criticize the American founding peripherally. He criticized it root and branch. He said, first of all, the natural rights doctrine is too limiting because it postulates a fixed human nature, and a fixed human nature limits the hope for progressive change that government can engineer. Because if human beings have no fixed nature, but are only creatures that acquire the culture in which they're situated, government, by manipulating the culture, can change human beings. Second, he said, the separation of powers was fine once. He said when we were 4 million people along the fringe of the continent, 80% of us living with 20 miles of Atlantic tidewater, then he said that was fine. But now we're a great continental nation united by copper wires and steel rails, and therefore we need a more nimble government, one of his favorite adjectives, a nimble government at the beck and call of a strong president with a marginalized Congress, so that the government can act as expeditiously as a complex society warrants. Now, this is the basic progressive non sequitur, which is that the more complex society becomes, the more government must intervene in that society to organize and direct it. Hayek and others, noting the law of unintended consequences that bedevils most government work, says the more complex society gets, the more information that is generated by markets, which is all markets are, information generating mechanisms, the less government knows relative to what needs to be known, and therefore the more modesty is required by government. What Hayek calls epistemic humility, humility about what we can in fact know.
And so, you know, as we think back, though, to the founders, and you come back again and again to Madison, to Jefferson, why do you believe they had the idea then? What gave them the sense that it was important to be open in the future? What gave them that belief? Where did that come from?
Well, they didn't all embrace that equally. Jefferson, one of the reasons Jefferson leapt at the Louisiana Purchase was so that he could have an ample land for a rural yeoman's republic. People, stable society on a land rooted there, no cities, keep your factories in Europe and all that, so that people would more or less be like Thomas Jefferson. A rival founder, Hamilton, star of a recent musical, said, no, he wanted an urban, churning, entrepreneurial, industrial, investing, restless society full of people rather like Alexander Hamilton. So there was a rival vision of what kind of people we should be. When they argued about things like the National Bank and the rest, they were actually arguing about what kind of people we would be. I once wrote a book read by dozens called Statecraft as Soulcraft. I gave the Godkin lectures at Harvard in 1981. And the subtitle of the book was What Government Does, not what government ought to do, but what government can't help but do. Government, by the economic regime it sets up and the legal system it has, necessarily shapes the character of people. And Jefferson and Hamilton understood this perfectly. They had two different sociologies of two different kinds of virtue. My contention is that capitalism doesn't just make us better off, which it manifestly does, it makes us better by enforcing certain virtues. There's a wonderful scene in de Tocqueville's Democracy in America where he's going down the Ohio River with slave-holding Kentucky to his left and industrial free soil Ohio to his right. And he says on the left, all was torpid and languid, no crackling energy. Ohio on his right was all crackling energy, sense of dynamism and hope and future. That's the, in a small, writ small was the kind of soulcraft that I think is involved in our arguments about economies, which I have a chapter in here called Political Economy, which is what we called the study of economics when Adam Smith invented the subject in The Wealth of Nations, published in the resonant year of 1776.
What should the role of government be? I mean, you argue throughout, and you've argued this for a long time, minimal role, government should have a small profile as possible. And yet, I mean, everybody knows there are some things that have happened since the founders that have made a huge difference.
Conservatives are not against ameliorative government. Conservatives do think we need to have a constant argument about the proper scope and actual competence of government. 1964, I cast my first presidential vote for Barry Goldwater. 27 million of us couldn't be wrong. He carried 44, he lost 44 states, but I've always said he actually won. It just took 16 years to count the votes. But Goldwater, this book is dedicated to the memory of Goldwater. In 1964, 77% of the American people said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing all the time or almost all the time. Today, the figure is 17%. 60-point collapse in the prestige of government as government's activism has risen. Now, I would think my progressive friends would be intensely interested in this because everything they want to do depends on strong government, and strong government at the end of the day depends upon confidence in government. With that gone, I mean, poor Elizabeth Warren, with her "I have a plan for that," all of her plans require energetic government. She's about to learn, I'm afraid, the old Jewish saying that if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. But
but it calls to mind a number of things that I won't bring up. But
well, let me give you an example to your question. Conservatives have no problem with Social Security if we bother to fund it, but that's another question.
if you what?
So, bother to fund it, provide proper funding. Government identifies an eligible cohort, the elderly, and writes them checks and mails them. It's good at that. What government is not so good at is what it began to undertake in the 1960s, model cities. We don't know how to build model cities. There's a sense in which that's as futile an enterprise as nation building, which is as futile an enterprise as orchid building. Cities, like nations, like orchids, are organic things, and they are not built by governments.
Medicare, you started with Social Security. How has the government done running Medicare?
Well, it's been constantly surprised because everything it predicted, all of its predictions for costs and eligibility were much too conservative. What we did in 1965 was attach the most rapidly growing portion of our population, the elderly, to our most dynamic science, which is medicine, as an entitlement. Probably half the medical treatments now in use, diagnostic, therapeutic, and pharmacological, did not exist in 1965 when we passed Medicare. Indeed, if pharmacology had been at all as developed then as it is now, we would have had Medicare Part D, the prescription drug entitlement, in 65.
So was that so are you saying Medicare was a mistake?
No, I do not think provision for the elderly is a mistake. I do think we're in danger of having a gerontocracy, that is, a government run by and for the elderly. The most rapidly growing in percentage terms age cohort in this country is Americans 85 years old or older. That matters because the average health care costs for a 55-year-old are for an 85-year-old are 5 times higher than the average cost for a 55-year-old. So longevity is a great social achievement. It's also ruinously expensive. So if we do not die when the Office of Management and Budget says we should.
So before we give up, or not give up on government, but set it aside, what else do you give government credit for? I mean, you mentioned Social Security, Medicare, I don't know, Medicaid, the states are more involved, the national highway, the federal highway system.
A Republican president put that forward.
The Defense Department, I mean, the national defense.
That is the first duty of government, is to protect the nation, yes. All for that.
Homeland Security, which is a new piece of the federal government.
Sure. But look at how we're actually governed today. For all the talk about discord in the United States, what's most frightening to me is consensus. It's as broad as the Republic. It extends from Elizabeth Warren to Ted Cruz. And it's as deep as the Grand Canyon, and it is this. We should have a large, well-armed, generous entitlement state and not pay for it. Everyone's agreed on that. I'm serious. The political class is more united by class interest than it is divided by ideology. And the class interest is to give the American people $1's worth of government and charge them 80 cents for it. The public likes it, will fob off the extra 20 cents on the unconsenting because unborn future generation that will get the bill. What's changed is this. We used to borrow money for the future. We fought wars for the future, built roads, dams, highways, and we'd borrow, and because the future was going to benefit from it, it was ethical to have them pay part of the burden. Today, we're borrowing to finance our own consumption of government goods and services, which is decadent. Beyond that, I can't say.
Well, so let's talk about taking care of those who are having a hard time taking care of themselves. What's the responsibility of the government?
The government is to help those who can't take care of themselves, but first of all, to help people help themselves. To take just one example in medicine, health savings accounts. You get a substantial tax preference for money when you buy high deductible health insurance, and you pay for your everyday expenses out of the tax-preferred savings in your health savings account. No American expects, well, some probably do, but most Americans don't expect auto insurance to pay for their windshield wipers or oil changes. Similarly, there are regular, everyday, predictable, small health expenses that people should pay out of their own savings to give them a sense of having skin in the game. There are things the government can do that help people provide for themselves rather than providing it for them.
Have your views on what true conservatism is, have they changed over the years, George, since you started writing? I mean, you wrote your first book, what, in the 1970s? How?
Mostly, it's in the chapter called The Judicial Supervision of Democracy. For many years, I believed, Bob Bork was a good friend of mine, and Bork was a judicial restraint man. I believed, as many conservatives did, in response to some of the more freewheeling decisions of the Warren Court, that majority rule required judges to be deferential to majoritarian institutions. Bob Bork and his friend at Yale Law School, Alexander Bickel, made much of what they called the counter-majoritarian dilemma, that judicial review is inherently anomalous in our society and should be used very sparingly. And I believed that for many years. The majoritarians believed, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, if the American people want to go to hell, I will help them, it's my job. So he would just step out of the way of majoritarian institutions. For a long time, I believed that, and then I began to think more clearly, and I began to think backward. I wrote my doctoral dissertation at Princeton. It was titled Beyond the Reach of Majorities. It's a phrase from Justice Jackson's opinion in the second of the flag salute cases, where the Supreme Court, reversing itself in just 3 years, said we were wrong to say that it is permissible to require Jehovah's Witnesses' children to salute the flag in contravention of their deeply held religious beliefs. He said, the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities to rescue them from the vicissitudes of politics. Now, when I began thinking about this, in other words, many years ago, and I only got it right recently, but I suppose I began thinking about it growing up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where my father was a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois. Local lore has it that it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Abraham Lincoln, a very prosperous circuit-riding railroad lawyer, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that he learned that Stephen A. Douglas, the Illinois senator, had successfully passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said, We will answer the question about the expansion of slavery into the territories by submitting it to a vote. Popular sovereignty in the territories would be the solution, said Douglas. Vote slavery up, vote it down. It's a matter of moral indifference. I believe that the greatest political career in the history of world politics, I say this with great deference to my friend Andrew Roberts and his man Churchill, but that Lincoln's, the greatest career in the history of world politics, was ignited by his saying that America is not about a process, majority rule. America is about a condition, liberty. And majorities should rule where the government rules, but the government should not always rule by majorities, and give people space again to have other values besides majority rule.
So you're talking about a more activist judiciary.
Much more activist judiciary, exactly.
Which, we think of originalism, much of Antonin Scalia's
I am not an originalist.
You're not an originalist.
And neither was he. Scalia famously called himself a faint-hearted originalist because, among other reasons, he came up against the Eighth Amendment, which forbids cruel and unusual punishments. If, as originalists say, we should construe the text by the common public meaning of the words at the time, that would mean, if we were to say things are cruel, are not cruel if they were accepted in 1787 in Philadelphia, ear cropping, branding, flogging, pillorying, all of those were used at the time that the founders put the words cruel and unusual punishments into the Bill of Rights.
You dedicate the book to Barry Goldwater. One of your favorite political figures was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. These are two very different people. Why do you admire both of them?
Well, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was finest social scientist surely ever to serve in a national legislature. I rather mischievously once said that while he was in the Senate, he wrote more books than his colleagues read. Pat famously said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. He was a great respecter of data. He was all his life an unreconstructed New Deal Democrat, but he understood the role of evidence. He said the role of social science can't tell us what to do, it can tell us the results of what we've done. And Pat was part of, with Daniel Bell and Nat Glazer and Irving Kristol and the others, James Q. Wilson, his good friend at Harvard, they were the founders and the organizers of that enormously influential small circulation journal of public interest that began to talk about skepticism about government's competence in intervening in a complex society. But he never stopped being a New Deal Democrat.
Ronald Reagan, you have been an admirer of Ronald Reagan. Has your view of him changed?
No.
Over time? I mean, how does he fit into the conservative system, theology?
I constantly hear people saying Ronald Reagan's assault on government. Ronald Wilson Reagan, I don't know if he was named after Woodrow Wilson, I certainly hope not. Ronald Reagan's formative years politically were during the New Deal, and he never turned on the basic social safety net of the society. That is, again, Social Security, something government knew how to do. His great criticism of the domestic policies were from the Great Society era, when government undertook to apply social science with an unmerited confidence.
I ask you about Ronald Reagan in order to bring up two words that do not appear in the book, and that's Donald Trump. Why did you leave? Well, you've already suggested this. Why did you leave his name out?
Well,
you mentioned Doris Day, I know.
First of all, I didn't want to write another Washington book. I do not have a feeling that Americans think insufficient attention is being paid to him. Second, it is a book of ideas, and he doesn't do ideas.
I let you say that a second time.
Third, I would like to have this book read, I was going to say 10 years from now when he'll be gone, 3 years from now when he'll be gone. So it's just a distraction. It's a distraction because, again, the very reverse, the obverse of everything conservatism stands for is populism. Populism means the direct translation of majority passion, not just ideas, majority passion, into governance. The ultimate populist moment was Donald Trump. I said it, you see. It's not Voldemort. The ultimate direct translation of passion into politics is Trump at the Cleveland Convention, only I can fix it. Now, conservatism says majorities are going to rule, majorities ought to rule, but, said Madison, in what a wonderful phrase, he says, we want mitigated democracy. We want public opinion slowed and filtered and refined through representative institutions, so that by the time it gets to actually being applied in laws, it has been filtered and refined. When the Founding Fathers went to Philadelphia in that sweltering summer of 1787, they did not go to create an efficient government. The idea would have horrified them. They wanted a safe government. Most important word in the Declaration of Independence is the verb to secure. Governments are instituted to secure pre-existing rights. We don't get our rights from government. Government exists for the primary purpose of securing those rights, to which end the framers created this complicated government. 3 branches of government, 2 branches of the legislative branch, each branch of the legislative branch with different electoral rhythms and different constituencies, supermajorities, judicial review, vetoes, veto overrides, a whole raft of blocking mechanisms in order to slow things down. There's a sense in which gridlock is not an American problem, it's an American achievement. There are an enormous number of people in this world who live under governments they wish could be gridlocked. But the idea that the American government is gridlocked is preposterous. People say, well, we had gridlock during the Obama years. Well, somewhat, but we passed the biggest financial regulation reform since the 1930s in the Dodd-Frank. We passed the biggest enlargement of the entitlement state since Medicare with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. The government moves, it just moves slowly, and they designed it that way. They wanted it to be difficult.
So that's where you put Donald Trump, but as we know today, he is the most, Republicans view him far and away as the most popular. You have what, more Republicans today admiring Donald Trump even than admired Ronald Reagan.
The Republican Party is more homogenous today than ever before in its history.
So what does that say about the Republican Party and conservatism?
It's a good party to leave, and I left. But the Republican Party ceased being a vessel of conservatism. It did not damage conservatism. It damaged itself. Look, who is happy today with a presidency unconstrained by an anemic Congress? Now, this is a long time in the making. It didn't begin on January 20th at noon on 2017. It began a long time ago as Congress began divesting itself of powers that it has no right to divest itself of. The first substantive words of the Constitution, the first words after the preamble, are all legislative power shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Vested. And it cannot be divested. Last week, in a Supreme Court opinion, there was the beginning of a revival of the Supreme Court enforcing the non-delegation doctrine, that there are certain delegations of power to the federal bureaucracy by Congress that are not permissible. Who is happy that a president of either party can impose taxes on the American people, which is what tariffs are, unilaterally because the president has been given this vast discretion by Congress? Who is happy that the president can take appropriations for purpose A and repurpose them to be spent on B, in this case a wall, because he is given the power by Congress to declare an emergency and do that. We have this enormous unfettered presidency, this anemic Congress, and no one, it seems to me, can or should be happy with this disequilibrium in the wonderful constitutional architecture that Madison gave us.
So what's happened to conservatism? I mean, what happened to all the arguments that George Will and other conservatives have made over all these years? I mean, how did it get shoved aside, in your view, and taken over, that space taken over by Donald Trump and what most Republicans say they support?
Well, we've known for a long time that the American people in many ways are ideologically conservative but operationally liberal. They talk like Jeffersonians, that government is best, that governs least, but they act like Hamiltonians and want to be governed by Hamiltonians. So there's an element of this cognitive dissonance in all of our politics. But I don't want to let progressives off the hook here. You're right, conservatives have done much to disgrace themselves. But it is progressivism that discredited the separation of powers. It is progressivism that celebrated executive leadership, that celebrated charismatic executive leadership. I'll give you one small sample here. When Franklin Roosevelt, who of course came to Washington first to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, when Franklin Roosevelt began his first fireside chat to the country over radio, which was as exciting to the country in its day as the internet is in ours, he began his remarks with two words that do not appear on the transcript in the library at Hyde Park. He began his speech, his address, he said, "My friends." Now, today that seems normal. We've had presidents who feel our pain. We've had presidents who are in our living room all the time. But it was a novel moment for Americans to think presidents ought to be their friends. I don't want the president to be my friends. I want him to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I want him to be the head of one of the three branches of one of our many governments. This idea that we ought to have a charismatic president who is the moral auditor of the country, who speaks whenever a rock star dies to express our national grief. It's, quite seriously, it is not healthy to have a political figure this central to our consciousness.
Ronald Reagan wasn't a charismatic president.
He was, and here's what happened. Conservatives for many years, because they saw progressivism mostly advanced by presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, conservatives for many years had a healthy suspicion of executive power. And they expressed this by advocating congressional supremacy. Their text was James Burnham, one of the founding editors of National Review, wrote a wonderful book called Congress in the American Tradition. Then, beginning at noon, January 20th, 1981, conservatives began to have the heady experience of Ronald Reagan and executive power, and they fell in love with it. And they began to lose what had been a wholesome suspicion of executive power, which, by the way, came from the founders whose original grievance with the government of Westminster was a grievance against the arbitrary power known as the royal prerogative.
Come back to, just quickly, to the judiciary and to, I mean, two things. Yeah. A number of Republicans, conservatives say, no, Donald Trump isn't perfect. There are a lot of things I don't like about him, but the economy's going great, and he's appointing conservatives to the federal judiciary.
But
one after another after another.
But Gorsuch, that's their argument. Yes, he does this, that, and the other thing, but Gorsuch, yeah.
But what about that argument, that that's a reason to support him because he's appointing judges?
Well, it's a reason to support a Republican president. Look, any Republican president would have cut corporate taxes. Barack Obama was in favor of cutting the corporate tax rate. Any Republican president would have had a deregulatory agenda. Any Republican president would have appointed judges largely culled from lists provided by people like the Federalist Society, of which I am a card-carrying member. That's not what Donald Trump brings that's unorthodox. As I say, any Republican president would have given voters that. What he brings is the manner, the lying, the name-calling, all of this, which I think will do more lasting damage to the country. You can't unring these bells than Nixon's surreptitious burglaries did. They were surreptitious. They were exposed, they were punished, and we moved on. It's going to be extremely difficult to restore the tone of American life that prevails from Washington through Barack Obama.
You're saying Trumpism lasts how much longer than the Trump presidency?
We don't know, because one of the things, again, my obsession with the elephantine presidency we have, he has shown how fast a president, using all the modern mass media, including the social media, can change the tone of our public life. Maybe, I'm not confident of this, I'm not used to looking on the bright side of things, but maybe...
You took away my last question, but... Save it.
Okay, but maybe someone with a different manner, someone who says, calm down, who repeats the next to last paragraph of Lincoln's first inaugural, we are not enemies, we must not be enemies, who appeals, as Lincoln did in that inaugural, to the better angels of our nature. Maybe someone like that can effect as abrupt a change as Mr. Trump has wrought. See, I do not think the American people are angry. The Fox viewers are angry, the MSNBC viewers are angry. The cable audience together is a small slice of this country. I think normal walking around Americans are sad and embarrassed and exhausted. And they're sad because they're embarrassed. And I think they will, I think Democrats make a huge mistake if they think the country wants transformation. I think the country wants restoration.
And you wrote about this, I think, a week or so ago. You wrote about one of your thoughts about what Democrats need to do in this election. And you mentioned be more modest. What were you talking about?
Well, I noticed in the paper this morning, Elizabeth Warren, who I have a warm spot in my heart for her because she brings gravity and weight to politics with her ideas. There's a thing in the New York Times this morning comparing the candidates on health care, and she says, no more half measures. Oh my goodness. Well, this is a woman who at her first, right after she announces her candidacy, she goes on a town hall with CNN and says, yes, single payer is fine. And now 177 million Americans get their health care from their employers and rather like it. Another 40 or so million Americans have other private health insurance and rather like it. They're not going to listen again when you say, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it, because they don't trust that anymore. It seems to me dangerous to tell the Americans, again, this is a complicated society. She says in this morning's paper, we shouldn't have half measures. We're talking about 18% of the American economy. We're talking about rural hospitals. We're talking about this astonishingly complex system applying to an elderly population. Probably 40% of all Medicare patients have chronic ailments that any one of which would have killed them before modern pharmacology. This complicated, worrisome, frightened, dangerous world we're living in with healthcare and all the rest. And she says, no half measures, we're going to remake it. No, you're not.
But not all the Democrats are for Medicare for all. Not all the Democrats.
No, but
Joe Biden isn't.
Joe Biden isn't, but the other 6 leading ones are.
So what are, okay, first of all, what should Democrats do if they have a hope of defeating President Trump?
Well, they should begin by talking about what people talk about around the kitchen table. And I guarantee you it's not abolishing the Electoral College, which isn't going to happen. I mean, just not. That's as close to a certainty as you can say in a democracy. I really don't think reparations for slavery, that's an interesting argument to have, but that's not what people are talking about. They're talking about healthcare costs. They're talking about prescription drug costs. By the time we have this election next time, they're going to be talking about the business cycle, perhaps. They're going to be noticing that, as I think I've said, when the next recession starts with a budget deficit of $1 trillion, that's going to be really interesting. There are wholesome worries people have about their infrastructure. I mean, they're saying, we promised this $1 trillion infrastructure, all these bright, shiny things. What happened? Talk about things that people care about.
Just quickly, you mentioned reparations. Just as a side question, do you think there's some solution when it comes to reparations?
I don't think, reparations.
Any form of reparation?
I think reparations of various sorts have been made over the years through affirmative action and before that in other social programs that were not targeted explicitly at people because of race, but covered people because of race. I think if you really want to ratchet up the discord in America, which is a perverse aim, but if you wanted to ratchet up the discord, begin allocating guilt over 8 generations since the end of slavery. It's a hopeless task. You've got all kinds of, I mean, a majority of Americans today are descended from people who were not here when the 13th Amendment was
But is the idea, is there any worth in the idea of it? I mean, if it could be.
There is worth in the idea of ameliorative measures to help those who don't have enough and those who have trouble taking advantage of the opportunities a society has, regardless of race, color, or creed. There is nothing, it seems to me, to be said for taking a slice of the American population and saying that we shall now have a kind of special reparations for you because of injuries done to you. Who's going to administer it? How do you calibrate it? Elizabeth Warren, I'm picking on her, but jeepers, she said this morning there should be I think I read this, correct me if I'm wrong, there should be reparations for gay people because before the Obergefell decision, establishing a right to same-sex marriage, gay people could not file joint tax returns. Now, enough. I mean, again, talk about things that don't make you sound strange to normal Americans.
What are conservatives to do in this next election? I mean, say if it's Joe Biden, a hypothetical. If Joe Biden is the nominee running against Donald Trump, what do you do if you're a conservative? If you're George Will, what do you do?
The most important thing for conservatives is to remove from the head of the Republican Party someone who's anti-conservative. So the most important thing for conservatives is to change the presidency. Ideally. Now, ideally, from this conservative's point of view, a Democrat would no doubt win and the Republicans would keep the Senate, and not much would happen legislatively unless there was serious compromise, which is what the system was designed to do in the first place.
But does that mean conservatives should vote for the Democrat if that's the way to remove President Trump?
Well, there are a couple of Democrats out there that would test even my desire to see the president go. But basically, if the choice is between a centrist Democrat and the current president, of course you do it to clear the ground and start over. First, you clear the ground. The logic of that, I don't need to draw a picture.
Okay. So who's the centrist Democrat? I mean, who are the centrist Democrats in this group?
Biden, Klobuchar, Hickenlooper, John Delaney. There are a lot of them.
And does one of them, do you think, stand a better chance, make a better, stronger case than the others?
Well, getting John Delaney's and Hickenloopers and all through this nominating process is difficult. Nominating Biden is difficult because of Biden. I mean, he's just breathtaking. Tell you a Biden story. In 2008, September, he's on the ticket with Obama running for vice president. Lehman Brothers melts down, the country's in panic. Biden thinks that George W. Bush as president is not giving the kind of robust presidential leadership he should be giving. And he says, well, in October 1929, when the stock market crashed, President Roosevelt, he said, President Roosevelt went on television. Now, I don't think that disqualifies him, but
So you'd still vote for him?
Joe is kind of an adventure.
So, all right, we're wrapping up. Your definition of conservatism, your definition of, say, the ideal, who out there on the political landscape fits the definition of a...
Pat Toomey, senator from Pennsylvania, Ben Sasse, who I think's been here or will be here soon. There are a lot of good people out there. Bill Weld, for Pete's sake, is running in the primaries against him. Bill Weld has read Hayek, not the Road to Serfdom, he's read the big one, the Constitution of Liberty. He's experienced, he's intelligent, he's very funny. He comes from a very old, very rich family, and he was asked one day, Governor Weld, did your family come over on the Mayflower? He said, no, my family came later. We sent the help on the Mayflower to get the cottage ready.
So does one of those folks you mentioned or somebody else fit the definition of who should run?
Yes. I voted for Ben Sasse in 2016. I wrote him in.
So I'm going to come back to the question you actually raised earlier. Is some of this is kind of a dark outlook, George. Leave us with something positive to take away from this session.
Well, I say in here that this book is a summons to pessimism, not fatalism, not despair, not acquiescence to vast impersonal forces, but pessimism in the sense that there's so much that can go wrong in a free society that you have to be wary at all times of the ways it can go wrong. Here's the bright side. No one ever got rich betting against the United States or against the American people. They are more sensible and less passionate and inflamed than some of their representatives would have us believe they are, or some of the people in my business would have you believe they are. The American institutions have been enormously durable. People rather cavalierly say we're in a constitutional crisis. We've had one constitutional crisis, that is, one crisis the Madisonian institutions could not handle, and that was the Civil War. Watergate, all the rest, the institutions took care of them just fine. So the architecture's fine if we reestablish the equilibrium. But most important reason for prosperity and for happiness is this great new book. The story is told, Andrew may correct me on this, story is told that when Margaret Thatcher, after she was elected head of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, but before she was Prime Minister, she was at a meeting of some of her members, and some guy was up nattering on about the beauties of centrism and about transcending ideology and all the rest. And Mrs. Thatcher reached into her capacious and justly famous handbag and pulled out a copy of Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, slammed it on the desk and said, "This is what we believe." In a few years, a president will take the conservative sensibility, slam it on the desk and say, this is what we believe.
George Will. And you are signing books afterwards. And he is signing books afterwards. Thank you all.